Picture an army that cannot go back. Not won't. Cannot. Behind it, a river 40 meters wide. In front of it, the war it came to fight. And underneath its boots, a strip of floating steel 1 lane wide, the only road connecting the two. This is the story of how one of the deadliest militaries on Earth marched an entire battalion onto that strip of steel, and how, in less than 72 hours, almost none of it marched back. Stay with me, because what happened on the banks of the Siverskyi Donets River in May of 2022 is still taught today as one of the purest case studies in how modern war actually gets won, not with the biggest army, but with the army that sees first. By the spring of 2022, the war in Ukraine had already stopped looking like the war Moscow planned. The dash for Kyiv had failed. The armored columns that were supposed to end this in days had been bled out on highways north of the capital, and the Kremlin had quietly redrawn its ambitions. No more grand encirclement of the whole country. Now the target was narrower, and in theory, easier, the Donbas. Two provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, already half-occupied since 2014, now to be swallowed whole. And to swallow them, Russian planners needed to link their forces coming down from the north near Izium with their forces already dug in around Luhansk. The plan looked clean on a map. It always does. Push west from the occupied town of Popasna, push south from Izium, meet in the middle near a city called Lyman, and you cut off tens of thousands of Ukraine's best-trained troops in a pocket with no way out. But maps lie about rivers, and the Donbas is laced with them. To get from the Russian-held East Bank to the positions they needed in the west, Russian units had to cross the Siverskyi Donets River not once, but repeatedly at a string of villages most people outside the region had never heard of: Dronivka, Serebryanka, and the one that would become infamous, Bilohorivka, a quiet farming settlement, a scattering of houses, a stretch of forest on the western bank. Nothing about it suggested history was about to happen there, except that the Ukrainian army had already worked out exactly what Russia needed to do next, and exactly where it would have to do it. This is the part people miss when they imagine modern combat. They imagine tanks, they imagine artillery duels. What actually decided this battle happened days before a single shell was fired. In the quiet, unglamorous work of watching, Ukraine's 17th Tank Brigade held positions on the western bank near Bilohorivka, and its reconnaissance teams had one job that spring: know where the Russians would try to cross before the Russians finished deciding it themselves. Small commercial quadcopters, the same kind you could buy in an electronics store, went up over the tree lines every day. Not to fight, to watch, to count trucks, to notice when engineering vehicles started massing on the far bank, because engineering vehicles only mean one thing near a river: someone is about to try to get across it. And in the first days of May, that is exactly what the drones found. Russian bridging units, elements tied to their 74th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, began staging pontoon sections near the eastern bank opposite Bilohorivka. A pontoon bridge is not a subtle piece of equipment. It arrives on trucks in segments, gets lowered into the water, and gets bolted together into a floating roadway wide enough for a single line of vehicles. It is loud, it is slow to build, and while it is being built, everyone working on it is standing in the open. Ukrainian forces watched this happen. They watched the first sections go into the water, and they let it keep happening, because a bridge that is only half finished cannot yet be used to move a battalion across, and a battalion that hasn't committed yet is a battalion that can still turn around. What Ukraine wanted was for Russia to commit. On the 8th of May, they got exactly that. Russian forces finished assembly of a pontoon crossing at Bilohorivka and began moving armor across it. Tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, fuel trucks, command vehicles. This wasn't a probe, a handful of scouts testing the water. Ukrainian officers on the ground would later describe what crossed that river as the better part of an entire Battalion Tactical Group, the standard building block of the modern Russian army, something in the range of 600 to 800 men, roughly 10 tanks, and around 40 other armored vehicles, all packed onto one narrow floating road at a time. Vehicle after vehicle rolled onto the pontoon, crossed, and fanned out into the tree line and the open fields on the western bank, digging in, preparing to push toward Lyman. And this is where the trap sprung its jaw, because a river crossing has a brutal, unforgiving physics to it that no amount of firepower can undo. Once you commit a column to a single-lane pontoon bridge, you cannot simply reverse it. A tank cannot do a three-point turn on a narrow floating road with another vehicle's bumper against its own. The column becomes a queue, and a queue only moves one direction until someone at the front decides otherwise. Every vehicle that crossed that river was making a bet that it would be able to either keep advancing advancing or come back the same way it went. Neither bet was safe. Ukrainian artillery had been positioned and ranged in advance, waiting on exactly this moment, and once enough Russian armor had committed to the crossing and to the western bank, the guns opened up. Units from the 17th Tank Brigade's artillery, some accounts point specifically to its howitzer battalions, others to the broader mix of Soviet-era guns and Western-supplied systems Ukraine was fielding by that point in the war, began walking fire directly onto the bridge, and the vehicle concentration stacked up waiting to use it. And because the crossing point had been under drone observation for days, this wasn't a wild barrage hoping to get lucky. The coordinates were already known before the first shell left the tube. The guns didn't need to search for the target. The target had been sitting still, in the open, for as long as it took drone operators to relay grid references back to fire control. What happened next is the part that made this battle famous, even inside a war that by that point had already produced tens of thousands of casualties. The pontoon bridge itself took direct hits and came apart, sections drifting loose in the current, severing the only route back to the eastern bank. On the western side, the vehicles that had already crossed were now trapped between a river they couldn't recross and an enemy that had just revealed exactly where they were sitting. On the eastern side, vehicles still queued to cross had nowhere to go either, jammed nose to tail on the approach road, unable to disperse fast enough before the next salvo landed. Russian forces tried over the following 2 days to rebuild the crossing. Ukrainian reconnaissance caught that too, and Ukrainian guns hit the replacement bridge as well. This wasn't a single unlucky strike, it was a sustained multi-day dismantling of an entire crossing operation, repeated as many times as Russia was willing to feed vehicles into it. By the time the fighting around Bilohorivka died down, in the middle of May, the numbers coming out of the wreckage were staggering even by the standards of that war. Ukrainian officials and independent open-source analysts, cross-referencing drone footage with commercial satellite imagery to confirm the damage was real and not just propaganda, put the toll at somewhere north of 70 armored vehicles destroyed or disabled, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, plus the bridging equipment itself, including at least one tugboat used to maneuver the pontoon sections. Analysts who track Russian order of battle concluded that one, and quite possibly two. Full battalion tactical groups had effectively been removed from the war in a matter of days, not weakened. Removed, a unit that loses most of its vehicles in 72 hours does not go back to fighting shape by the following week. It goes back to a depot, if it goes back anywhere at all. Among the dead was a Russian engineer colonel, one of the officers responsible for the bridging operation itself, killed while the crossing was still under Ukrainian fire. His death was one of several senior engineering officer losses in this same stretch of the war, a signal of just how exposed the specialists running these crossings really were. There is no cover for a bridge engineer standing in open water bolting pontoon sections together while artillery is walking toward him. What made this defeat sting even harder for Moscow is that it didn't stay hidden. In an earlier era of Russian information control, a disaster like this might have been buried, spun, or simply denied. But by 2022, war had a camera in the sky over almost every square kilometer of the front line, and this fight had several. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense released its own drone footage within days, showing the wreckage strewn along both banks and the broken bridge drifting in the current. Independent researchers took that footage and matched it, feature for feature, against commercial satellite images taken the following day, confirming burn marks, vehicle positions, and the exact state of the crossing were consistent with the claims being made. This wasn't a story Ukraine could inflate. It was a story the satellites backed up from orbit, and perhaps the most damning verdict didn't come from Kyiv at all. It came from voices inside Russia's own information ecosystem. Prominent Russian military bloggers, the same commentators who had spent months defending the invasion and downplaying its setbacks, broke ranks over Bilohorivka. One of the most widely followed among them wrote publicly that the events at the river had exhausted his patience, describing the loss of at least one, possibly two, entire battalion tactical groups as the result not of bad luck but of what he called sheer stupidity in the Russian command. When the people cheering for your side start saying the quiet part out loud, you know the failure wasn't a close call. It was a self-inflicted wound, and everyone watching could see the knife. So what actually went wrong? from a purely military point of view. Strip away the drama and you're left with a lesson that gets taught in staff colleges for a reason. A river crossing is one of the single most dangerous operations any army can attempt, because for a short window of time your force is compressed into a line, moving slowly, with almost no ability to maneuver, spread out, or take cover. Doctrine around the world treats this moment as a maximum vulnerability event, something you protect with overwhelming air cover, layered artillery suppression on the far bank, smoke, deception, multiple crossing points used simultaneously to split the enemy's attention, and above all, speed. You want to be across and dispersed before anyone on the other side finishes calculating where to aim. Russian forces at Bilohorivka appear to have skipped or badly under-resourced almost every one of those safeguards. Reports at the time describe repeated attempts using largely the same crossing point rather than multiple dispersed sites, which meant Ukrainian observers only ever had to watch one location closely instead of splitting their reconnaissance across several. There was no meaningful contest for the sky above the bridge, which meant the same handful of Ukrainian drones that spotted the first crossing attempt were free to keep watching every attempt that followed, and there wasn't enough suppressive fire directed at the Ukrainian gun positions on the far bank to stop them from ranging in and firing at will. Put those failures together and you don't get a battle, you get a shooting gallery, with the only variable being how many more times Russian commanders were willing to send vehicles back into it. On the Ukrainian side, the win wasn't really about the artillery at all, even though the artillery is what did the physical damage. The win was built entirely on patience and observation. Ukrainian units didn't rush to strike the moment they spotted pontoon sections being unloaded on the far bank. A half-built bridge tells you where the enemy wants to cross. It doesn't tell you when they'll commit enough force to make hitting them worthwhile. So they waited. They let engineers finish the bridge. They let the first vehicles start rolling across. They let the column compress into that single, irreversible lane. Only once the trap had fully closed on its own did the guns fire, and by then, the choice to retreat had already been taken away from the people on the other end of that barrage. That is the difference between an ambush and a firefight. A firefight is two sides shooting at each other and hoping. An ambush is one side choosing exactly when the fight becomes unfair. There's a broader thread running through this story that goes far beyond one river in Luhansk Oblast, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the same thread that runs through nearly every major engagement of this entire war. Cheap, commercial-grade drone reconnaissance didn't just support this battle, it was the battle. Take away those small quadcopters circling above the tree line for days before a single shell was fired, and this becomes a completely different, far less lopsided fight. Maybe the Russians get their bridgehead. Maybe the push toward Lyman succeeds on schedule instead of stalling for weeks. The gap between a functioning army and a broken one, in this war more than almost any war before it, has repeatedly come down to who saw the target first, not who had the bigger gun. And there's a harder truth underneath that one. The kind of truth militaries don't like putting in press releases. Bridges, fords, mountain passes, any place where an army is physically forced to compress into a line are becoming some of the most dangerous terrain features on a modern battlefield precisely because they used to be considered survivable. Doctrine written in the 20th century assumed that if you moved fast enough and used enough smoke and covering fire, the enemy simply wouldn't have eyes on you at the moment you were most exposed. That assumption is gone. Cheap drones mean somebody almost always has eyes on you now. The armies that will win the next generation of wars aren't necessarily the ones with the newest tanks. They're the ones that have already rewritten their playbook around the fact that they can be watched constantly, and that the cost of forgetting that, even for the length of time it takes to cross one river, can be an entire battalion. By the time the smoke cleared along the Siverskyi Donets in the middle of May 2022, the surviving Russian troops from that crossing attempt had pulled back to the eastern bank, and for a while, the front line in that particular stretch of Luhansk simply held. The push toward Lyman that this crossing was supposed to enable would eventually happen, months later, through other routes at other costs. But the battalion that tried to force its way across at Bilohorivka never got there. It ended its war on the banks of a river it never should have tried to cross the way it did, watched the entire time by machines small enough to fit in a backpack, and undone in the space of a few days by an enemy that understood the oldest rule in warfare better than it did: never let your enemy see you before you see them.